Mike Burgess, the ASIO boss, was even more blunt. He says that China's responsible for the largest scaled and sophisticated theft of intellectual property in human history. Can we still run this line and this message from the government that we will cooperate where we can and disagree where we must when dealing with a country that is undertaking such cyber theft?
Well, as I said, Kieran, we can grow the relationship between Australia and China and stand up for our national interests if we manage our differences wisely. Now, we have said that our assessment of our national interests, of our strategic interests, hasn't changed, but we will pursue these differences calmly and consistently. And that's exactly what you've seen us do. We have always backed in our security agencies, our defence forces to do their jobs. Our job as political leaders is to pursue and to manage those differences calmly and consistently.
The trade relationship has grown regardless of any hiccups, any problems in recent years. It's a quarter of our national trade is with China. What do you put that down to, the complementarity between our two economies?
Well, Kieran, nations trade with each other when it's in their interest to do so, and there is a strong complementarity between Australian exports and Chinese demand. We've seen that grow in recent times, and that's why we've always argued that those $20 billion of trade impediments imposed by China were not just harmful to the relationship between our countries, but hurt China itself. These are goods that were in demand by the Chinese market. And as we see, now that these impediments have lifted, we're down to about $1 billion of impediments from that $20 billion left. There is strong demand for Australian goods, and that's a good thing. That said, the Australian government, while wanting to maintain that trade with China, is keen to support our businesses to diversify their trade markets. And one of the big focuses that you've seen from us recently is in the Southeast Asia Economic Strategy to 2040, where we're really seeking to deepen that trading relationship with our own immediate region, with Southeast Asia. And Nicholas Moore, as our Special Envoy to Southeast Asia, has led an intensive engagement effort to build those relationships. At the same time, you see growing trade relationships with other friendly countries in the region, particularly through our trading agreements with India in recent times. South Asia is a very significant economic opportunity for Australia. So that trade diversification agenda will continue. It's an important thing that we pursue in Australia's national interest.
Should Australia consider and support China's bid to join the Comprehensive Regional Trade Agreement?
So Australia's position on parties wanting to enter into the CPTPP has been clear and consistent. We've said that parties wanting to join the CPTPP need to demonstrate that they're able to meet, adhere to and comply with the rules, the very high standards and rules set out in that agreement. We'd also want to see countries seeking to ascend to the CPTPP to have a demonstrated track record of compliance with trade commitments that they have entered into. Now, that said, the entry process into the CPTPP is a process that is undertaken by consensus by all parties to the agreement. So that's something that would unfold for all countries seeking to enter into the agreement.
The Middle East catastrophe continues. What's the latest advice you have for our viewers this morning on the number of Australians stuck in Gaza?
So, Kieran, we continue to support 67 Australians in Gaza with consular assistance, and that means continually communicating with them the best information and options available to them to protect their safety and to advise them of options for leaving Gaza. We were very pleased and relieved that we were able to get 25 individuals that we were supporting across the Rafah crossing on November 1 and 2. Unfortunately, there haven't been further crossings by Australians of that border crossing point since then. But we thank the diplomatic efforts of Qatar, of Egypt, of the United States in seeking to broker that crossing. It's something that Australian consular officials, Australian diplomats and Australian Foreign Ministry officials work very hard at to try and press for further passage for Australians across that border crossing.
And is there any prospect over the next 24 hours or so that we might see further evacuations?
Well, it's a rapidly changing situation, Kieran. We are pressing very hard because we know how dire the situation is in Gaza. It really is a very serious humanitarian situation there. That's why we're pushing to get Australians out across that Rafah border crossing, but it's also why we're pushing very hard to get humanitarian assistance in. We've committed $25 million in aid to get food, water, medical assistance, fuel that is desperately needed in Gaza to the people that need it the most. And that's also why we've been calling for a humanitarian pause to enable that desperately needed humanitarian support to get to the people that need it safely.
You've been calling for a pause, the Foreign Minister has. Your colleague Josh Burns, he has written at the weekend that he does not support the idea of a humanitarian pause. Is the government divided on this issue?
Well, Kieran, I read Josh's piece. I thought it was a really good contribution from an outstanding local member who has been spending a lot of time really listening to his community, particularly the Jewish community in Melbourne, who is hurting incredibly at the moment. I mean, we cannot forget that there are still, on top of the 1,400 Israelis who were murdered in the terrorist atrocity committed by Hamas, there are still more than 200 hostages in Gaza at the moment. You can only imagine the anguish and the anxiety and the terror that the friends and family members of those hostages must be experiencing at the moment, thinking about the plight that they're in. Now, that said, Josh's opinion piece made the case against a ceasefire. Now, a ceasefire is traditionally viewed as part of a political process where the parties come together, the parties to a conflict come together in order to seek to negotiate as part of a broader political conclusion to a conflict. What we have been calling for in a humanitarian pause is a different thing. That's saying that we recognise that the parties aren't in a position where they can negotiate a political settlement to this issue at present, but there is a desperate humanitarian need now that can't wait for discussions, that can't wait for those kinds of negotiations. We need to get that food, water, medical supplies and fuel into Gaza as soon as possible to help those people who are absolutely desperately in need. And many other members of Parliament have spoken with their Muslim communities. Australia is, half of us were born overseas or have a parent born overseas. We are intensely connected anytime there's a crisis or a conflict anywhere in the world. And I've spoken to my constituents and I've heard about people in my community who've lost many family members living in Gaza. So their anguish and their desperation to do something about the humanitarian issue is something that the government is hearing too.
Tim Watts, thanks for your time.